Hello, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of week 3. Well done on Thursday's presentations. I'm so looking forward to seeing how all these things develop over the coming weeks. I will share my screen. There's a few things I want to talk about. Okay, so Project 1 was a focus on reconsiderations, and this lecture is a continuation into that. I gave this title as I finished preparing it, and I think that's often the way things can happen. So this lecture is called Being In versus Looking At, and perhaps this is what I'm on about, and perhaps we all should be. Being in and now looking at, and apologies for the lack of permission to use this shot. Hope you understand it. I just found it on my screen. I must have clicked it in term 2. But you know, that is an idea of being in space, being in class versus kind of just looking at it, the idea of class, which is perhaps where we're at now. 2 of 6 reconsiderations I introduced a couple of weeks ago. I feel we're getting into that deeper conversation about befriend and tend and mend, introduced to us by Caroline. The entanglement of scales, I think, is something we will keep discussing. All of these will. Thanks to Rem Koolhaas and Ben, of course. Site specificity from Dr. Sue-Ann Ware. This idea of deep time that Tyson's put out there. I also want to let's look at Edmund Bacon today, and I want to do that with a little bit of depth, but honestly, I find it quite hard. It's a terrific book. I'll talk about it as we go through. I also want to speak today about this idea from Beth Meyer that the site speaks prior to the act of design. And I also want to speak about some wording, I suppose, and strategies I investigated as part of my master's some years ago, but it still rings true in my head. So I thought I should bring this in because I guess it's part of my language, and I guess that's what I see some of these terms that, you know, we're all together for the next 10 weeks or so, and just so we're speaking the same language. Small, Medium, Large, Extra Large was a book put out by Rem Koolhaas, OMA's Rem Koolhaas, some years ago, about 20 years ago, 25. I do have a copy. It's a bloody good book, you know, doorstop. I think part of its success was it just became a big book, something of scale of a book, and they made it bigger and thicker, and it just rings true. It's a very dense thing. Design of Cities by Edmund Bacon, which is what I'd like to talk about today, actually, amidst a few things. Deep time. So Tyson talks about, you know, his suggestion of deep time, and he puts words to the idea that 500 years ahead, and perhaps that can seem a little bit crystal ball. How do we see into the future? How to look ahead? Edmund Bacon, he writes as a historian, how to look at the past and make sense of things, and in that sense, how to look behind us and learn, I guess. Edmund Bacon's book is now on the Legato. We're quite restricted, actually. You know, there's only a certain number of pages. I think it's 1 chapter or 50 pages or something. So I had to sort of be specific. But if you ever get your hands on the book, it's terrific, actually. It's really terrific in a particular perspective. They're both men's perspectives. I'm just going to acknowledge that. They're of different eras. One's the 1950s, and Tyson, of course, is very current. Their backgrounds are different. Tyson's an Indigenous Australian. I should look it up. I think Edmund Bacon is, I don't know, actually, if he's English or American. I must look that up. I'm sorry I haven't. And different sort of positions. But, you know, so what? Does that need to be significant? I mean, that's just a question I put there. But I guess I'm trying to draw attention to be careful, be mindful of what we read, what we all say, and just just check in who's writing it, why they're writing it, because perhaps it helps to check one's biases, one's own biases and authors' biases. I think it's just good to keep things in context in this complex world. Kate Grenville, the Australian author, I've also put her book on our resource list. A Room Made of Leaves. Kate wrote The Secret River. She's an Australian author, and she wrote The Secret River, which was about the early settlement story. She wrote it about 20 years ago, and it became a Sydney Theatre Company play, and then it became a TV show. It's terrific. Her latest book's only come out in the last 10 months, and I've mentioned it quickly, but it's a rethink on the foundational story of Australia. John MacArthur is seen as the founder of the Australian wool industry and lauded for that fact. So that's from 250 years ago. But in this book, it's written from his wife's point of view, Elizabeth McGregor, and he's seen as much more of a bully with insecurities and elevated sense of his own worth, really, and no sheep farmer. And he was drawn back to Australia twice while he was out here for many years, and the first time for about 4 years, then the second time for about 7, both to go to court over charges. And it's in that time that the sheep industry grew, and it's largely now being reconsidered and re-seen to be his wife's story to tell. And I think that's but she was a sheep. She knew how to rear sheep in her youth, and that seems to be what came to the fore in this book. And I think the line I want to draw you to, it's just on the back cover. At some time in the unimaginable future, a reader will pore over these items, looking for the past to show itself. To that person and to you, the reader of these words, I can only say, do not believe too quickly. And I think that's probably a good axiom to hold for everything, including this lecture. So to impose, perhaps what we're doing is, in the world of landscape architecture and architecture and all the design fields, there is a sense of imposition. And I think it is important to check one's bias. Elizabeth Meyer, who's also on the resource list in the Leganto link, says the site speaks prior to the act of design. And that's a sentiment that speaks into the Aboriginal idea of country, this idea that the site has a voice, really, prior to us coming along and thinking, what should we do? What should we do to it? Personally, I try to always reconsider, and I try and bias what I call fundamental assets about the site and check in on my own personal biases. And I have to be honest, I'm not always successful, but I think we can only try. Where I want to take this idea of thinking, Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was built on fundamental assets and an idea that the site speaks prior to the act of design. So I want you to hear me using these terms: fundamental assets, site speaks prior to the act of design. I want you to hear me using them and just start connecting the dots. I'll speak into them. That is a picture of ancient Rome, about 400 to 600 BC. Their version of the Acropolis. They did it after the Greeks, but it was a mighty building, and it was put on top of one of the 7 hills of Rome, Capitoline Hill, which you can see about in the centre there, which is strategically in between the river and the surrounding circle of mountains. Ancient Rome was famously settled around 7 hills, although the Capitoline was the smallest. It was the symbolic centre. See, look, it's just a small one. It was the symbolic centre of the ancient city, both spiritually and politically. From 750 BC, the hill has allowed dominion over the control of land traffic. So you could see everything from it, and the Tiber River, thanks to its height of 48 metres above sea level. Here, the Etruscan king Tarquinio Prisco built the imposing temple of Jupiter, making it rise to a religious centre as well as a very political centre, influential. So they built this great temple. Now we're going to step ahead. This thing burns down, it gets rebuilt. It's hilarious. And then it moves into Baroque and Renaissance building. And I think it's very interesting to see this. So I want you to keep in mind this idea of time. This is now called the Campandoglio, or Capitoline Hill. It's the most important and enchanting of the 7 hills on which Rome was founded. The 16th century project of the current square is the work of Michelangelo. We're going to talk about this a little bit. The strategic position of the hill, steep sides, it made it a real acropolis of the city. The first historical notes of it can be found in some stories by the early poets. Now it gets more interesting. The Capitoline name derives from the discovery of the head, or caput, of the Etruscan warrior Aulus Vipsania during the numerous excavations and restorations of its foundations to erect the temple. So look at the timing of that. The temple, which is not that building, the temple is that building up on the top. So the temple, when they were building that, they found a head underneath it, and that was almost 500 BC to 616 BC. The name of the entire hill is assumed to have been created by Caput Oli, from which Capitolium. Chris, I need you to check in on this. Recent excavations of the Capitoline uncovered an early cemetery under the Temple of Jupiter. So that, to me, is super interesting. So you have these 7 hills, and we're probably talking 1000 BC or 900 BC. One of its first uses was as a cemetery. Then about 300 or 400 years later, when they are digging around for about to build this thing, they find a head. And that's when they name it Caput, or the capital. That goes straight into Washington in DC being the capital, and I use the word capital all around the world. So this is a foundational city-making scenario, and it's occurred in its genesis from a cemetery, this idea of life and death being sacred or important, and the top of the hill being chosen. This is Capitoline Hill today, with that wonderful, wonderful disc. It's sort of or an ellipse with that pattern that Michelangelo put on. I don't know if I think you can see my screen, but this is Capitoline Hill here. So these are the Baroque buildings. The old temple is well and truly gone. Apparently there's hardly anything there of it. I have been here, but I don't remember seeing anything of the old temple. But this space is magic. This is it down on the ground. And you can see, looking out, the kind of overview of the rest of the city it would have always had. This is Edmund Bacon's book. And this is something I want you to really take out of this lecture. And I meant to change that word, and I'm sorry I didn't. I want to call it the principle of the second person. So I'm going to read a few lines of this because it's a hard book to get hold of and you may not. Any really great work has within it seminal forces capable of influencing subsequent development around it, and often in ways unconceived by its creator. The great beauty and elegance of Brunelleschi's arcade of the Foundling Hospital shown on the right of the engraving above. So this one over here. Found expression elsewhere in the piazza. It goes on. The first significant change in the square following the completion of the arcade in 1427. So now we're talking Baroque Renaissance architecture. It was designed by, however, in the form of the square. I'm just going to read on. It was a great decision of Sandburg to overcome his urge towards self-expression and follow, almost to the letter, the design of the then 89-year-old building of Brunelleschi. This design set the form of Piazza della Santissima. The concept of space created by several buildings designed in relation to one another, and from this, the principle of the second person can be formulated. It's the second person who determines whether the creation of the first one will be carried forward or not. Now that is a very interesting thing to consider in the making of cities. So here is this space we're talking here, 1427, 1454, you can see just some additions to this. 1629, now these other sides and flanks start getting built around it. Then the positioning of these three dots or sculptures begins to have an impact on the greater city, and these lines drawn begin to have an imposition of order, which is that word I used before, this imposition. Let's see. It's impossible when to Piazza di Arnhem without being confronted with complete enormous design composition. Powerful expression received is largely due to the interplay of points in space. Well portrayed by Bacon over in these drawings. The points in space defined by the sculpture with the formal facades of the medieval and Renaissance buildings behind them. One might call this a Renaissance ordering of the space of a medieval square. So we're trying to get order. This is all deeper reading. Design in depth. This is a classic Baroque kind of imaging here. You see it happening in paintings. Everywhere you get a foreground, you get a middle ground, you get a distance. It sets up the scene. It sets up the scene, and it sets up what you'd call the scenographic. I'm just jumping to the... one function of architecture to create space is to intensify the drama of living. Just jumping to the second paragraph there. The principle of the recession plane and of design in depth is illustrated in the Paul Klee drawings to the left. Please have a go at reading this if you can get it off the reading list. Here's my favourite space. This is Capelin Hill. And Bacon just does a little analysis. So here is when some of the buildings were there. And this is what Michelangelo had to deal with. And he pulled a line out of the centre of the building, drew it over the hill that was there. It's only by reconstructing the Capelin Hill as it existed before Michelangelo went to work on it that we can comprehend the magnitude of this artist's genius in creating the Campidoglio. It forms a link between the early Renaissance expressions of urban design in Florence and the great Baroque developments in Rome. Sketch. I'm just looking. The approach Michelangelo took produced one of the great masterpieces of all time. That's a pretty big statement, but it's true, I think. The actual basis for the artist's design was an enormous intellectual achievement by a single act of will. So this idea of imposition. He established a line of force on the axes of the Palazzo del Senatore. Sorry about my Italian, I don't have it. A line which in effect became the organising element that pulled chaos into order. And the line is shown in yellow on that plan over there. So pulling development of order. In their discussion of the angle between the two flanking buildings and its significance in relation to perspective as diminishing or increasing distance, historians sometimes lose sight of the fact that this angle was determined long before Michelangelo started work. So that is just a lovely angle into the idea that the site speaks prior to the act of design. So what he did was repeat the angle already set by the Palazzo de Conservatori, symmetrically on the other side of the axis. Accepting that angle as a point of departure, he set about to treat the space it created. The decision he made is remarkable because it contained elements of two violently contradictory points of view. So he saved the basic structure of the two palaces, but on the other hand, he created a totally new effect. You might have thought a man of such drive towards order and beauty would have swept away the old buildings in order to give free rein to his own creative efforts, and that such modesty would have led to a hodgepodge compromise. Michelangelo has proved that humility and power can coexist in the same man. It's a very nice line. That it is possible to create a great work without destroying what is already there. I think there's some really good lessons in this. Order arrives on the capital. One of the greatest attributes of the composition is the modulation of the land. Without the shape of the oval and its two-dimensional star-shaped paving pattern, as well as its three-dimensional projection in the subtly designed steps that surround it. The unity and coherence of the design would not have been achieved. The use of that oval is magic in that space that is actually kind of disorganised. And then there's been facades added to make it feel more organised. But you can see this is a sort of founding, what am I saying? a foundation. It's a foundation of modern city building. And just to refer that, don't keep questioning all these things. And I guess that's what I'm trying to pull us towards. Design structure of Baroque Rome. Here we start to see the Vatican up here. This is the origins of the Vatican, but this is before the dome went on the top, and it was a massive building. It took decades and decades and decades. So very much the principle of the second person, and that you're plotting now to do steps that may not eventuate for 100, 200, 300, 500 years to think of Tyson's, and to think that these sites, where they gained importance over 1,000 years before that, more, 1,500 years. Sixtus V, in his effort to recreate the city of Rome into a city worthy of the church, saw clearly the need to establish a basic overall design structure in the form of a movement system as an idea. Anyone interested in transport and the walkability around the site at White Bays, this is very interesting. And at the same time, the need to tie down its critical parts in positive physical forms which could not easily be removed. He hit upon the happy notion of using Egyptian obelisks, which they'd stolen, of which Rome had a substantial number, and he erected these at important points within the structure of his design. The power of this idea is demonstrated on the next 6 pages, and here can be seen what actually happened to the Basilica of St. Peter in various stages between the erection of the obelisk by Sixtus in 1586 and the completion of the Bernini colonnade. The design influence of the deliberate act of Sixtus was realised 80 years after his death. So it did not stem from any direct power he exercised during his lifetime. The point in space demarcated by the obelisk became the determinant in later construction because of the power of the idea in men's, I wish I said people's, minds, transmitted over generation by the physical fact of the obelisk's existence. This is the obelisk, centrally located to that front door. You'll have to, it's such a good article, you'll have to read it. But Bacon goes on to analyse the wider city of Baroque Rome. This is Kaplan Hill over here. And he begins to see how, with the placing around of these obelisks, how it created in time all these links. And he's able to draw these out. The impact of Sixtus V's ideas demonstrated here is the unfolding of one of the most remarkable design processes in history. The impingement of the ideas of Sixtus V on the minds of clients and architects long after he was dead. The impact of his ideas is brought to light in the following series of diagrammatic plans, especially prepared for this book. In them, time is shown by colour. Something to note, everyone. Time is shown by colour, and various drawings and engravings of different periods are juxtaposed to portray the changing form of Rome over the 3 centuries. That's 300 years we're talking here. So suddenly this idea of looking 500 years ahead, it feels less like Tyson's asking us all to explain the universe. It feels, we need to be able to take these ideas on. You can see here again an obelisk there, how this creates this sort of amplification of these buildings. And that when you read this article, it says, it was silly to have 2 churches there, but they decided to do it because of the power of the space. And it took years to do it. Here are the 2 churches whose entire justification is the role they play in the larger structure of the city's design. The buildings are neither totally of the square nor totally of the street. yet they link both, and they're related to both as well as to the obelisk of Sixtus V. Okay, hold those ideas there, that principle of the second person and Bacon's analysis of Rome. Just hold it there. You're holding it? Now I want to move us to this more, a more contemporary idea, perhaps. Beth Myers, The Site Speaks Prior to the Act of Design. Her article, which I don't think I've put the... It's in a book called The Culture of Landscape Architecture, which is from 1994, and the article is called Landscape Architecture as Modern Other and Postmodern Ground. Now, I'm just going to close the door because it's a Saturday and children are loud. Hang on. Can everyone be quiet? I'm just trying to record something. Okay, I'm back. Noisy family silenced. So Elizabeth Meyer, the thing I want to draw your attention to here is this, because the whole article is terrific. I'll see if I can get the whole thing too. I've spoken with the library and everything's a bit problematic, I have to say, but I'll see if I can get the whole thing to you. Here are the important bits, so I want to talk about it within a lecture format. Man-made and natural, landscape, cyborgs, and hybrids. Just try and remember this idea. What can we pull out of there? It's a pretty detailed article. Let's read up here. Figure ground drawings by Wayne Copper represents the built world as mass and void, solid and open. I would argue that their value as analytical tools is limited to a coarse grain of study, regardless of whether the spatial model relies on object buildings or figural space. Figure ground diagrams fail to represent the spatiality of trees, landform, and other in-between conditions. So Beth Meyer is very good at discussing this in-between stuff. The figure ground renders the world black or white, either or, and that's a problem for us. Another restrictive frame that she tries to deconstruct in this article is the original pair, man and nature, or man-made and natural. And you've heard me bring this up with a few of and it's why I do not like the word nature, because it's really problematic because of the binary, the either or. So in place of this either or relationship, a both and relationship can be described by the hybrid, human nature and non-human nature. And that is a more useful way for us to think of talking about landscapes, and certainly on White Bay, how we talk about this. And when I hear people talk about, I want to bring nature into it. It suddenly brings, I have this binary flashlight go off in my mind. The city is bad and nature is good, and we need to move beyond that. And Beth Meyer's article is very good for that. I do appreciate that she gives a lot of emphasis to the fantastic images by James Rose, landscape architect James Rose. He's American. In the 1950s, he experimented with representational modes that would convey the layered and transparent spaces created by trees. So rather than being sort of reductive and dots, etc., you start to see each tree is not just a tree, it's its own spatial form. So when you want to put vegetation on a site, you need to get really specific. Because if you say, I just want to put nature, and you put cherry trees and palm trees, well, good for you. But it lacks reality and it lacks meaning. And it's the opposite of site specificity, unless you particularly want to put those things. But I need you in fourth year to start to get always very specific about the plants on site, how you draw them, why you draw them, and their spatial qualities. And this one on the left particularly is great because it's taken from the perspective, so where the viewer is, are quite low, like a human one. This one's a little bit more bird up the top, but this one, you'd say we're in it. You know, it's called being in. This one is probably called looking at. And in this lecture, I just want to draw a little attention to those phrases I'm using also. Let's see, good on you, Rose. Rather than depicting trees as opaque solids, he suggested their translucence and their articulated spatial characteristics with line and tone drawings. Beautiful. Okay, so off that page, try and remember that. Human nature and non-human nature. I don't mind the terminology sort of modified, highly modified, less modified. But what I don't like is hearing about nature. Beth Meyer talks very well, writes very well about Olmsted's emerald necklace in Boston. Do we get an image of that? I think we do. Oh, there's a close-up of Rose's forms. And here she talks about the emerald necklace around Boston. This connection of less modified by man spaces and more modified by humans spaces, and the landscape cyborg or hybrid. Beth Meyer uses this wording quite well, pleasure in the confusion of boundaries. So taking that on as a landscape architect, that's the space we all need to be working in. The kind of unsureness, perhaps it's confusing, I don't know where something quite starts, I don't know where something quite ends. Is one of this, is this a canal? Is this the wetland? Is that the park? When does it, you know, when did this stop being a sort of puddle of water and start becoming a park? This is the 1904 photograph of the Fens. So to draw us into the site, this idea of the site speaks prior to the act of design. There's White Bays, and here's me at this, you know, what I can only think of as my bias towards kind of appreciating the horizon and that sort of visual Baroque setup of depth with the Sydney Harbour Bridge at the end of the axis, and now the land, the fingers of land, the site, become the framing devices. Okay, next concept. I'm going to rip through them. I've been dying to kind of talk with you all a bit more about them. So these come from my master's work. The term I really want you to take home is fundamental assets. My master's 20, 25 years ago was looking firstly at urban beaches before it became a collaborative design project with an Aboriginal community up in Western Australia. But the first half of it, the first 18 months, was about beaches. And through many conversations with wonderful colleagues and landscape architects and friends, where I got to was this idea, was four main kind of ways of thinking about it. And some of you have heard me talk about this in a lecture I gave in January. I'm talking about it in a little different way with some more detail today. But the fundamental assets, and I looked at about 10 or 12 beaches in Australia, they're not all on the screen here. Bondi's there at the bottom. And some other beaches around the world I was lucky enough to get to. What are the fundamental assets? And now you can ask that of any site. But just to give you an idea, what are the fundamental assets of, say, something like Bondi Beach or any beach? Okay, one might be that it has a beach, so it's actually got sand. Another might be it's got an orientation to the sun that's positive. One might be that it's concave. You know, that can be a very comforting, the actual shape, the form of it, how that actually makes a beach. Some do and some don't. Dramatic crest announcement. Does it have a dramatic experience when you arrive at it? And you could use that for any site. You could certainly use that for our site. Does it have a dramatic approach announcement as you walk down the hill to it? Can you see it? I would suggest White Bays does. I mean, the crest in a way is the Anzac Bridge, although it's not, you know, then it dislocates with its approach. On the beach, is the beach view a wide one? Does it have a moderate tidal difference, which of course is good for sorry, I'm getting distracted by my phone. Good for swimming and humans. Does it have clean, fine sand? Does it have rock pools? Does it have smooth rocks versus rough rocks? Sunrise over the water. sun sets over water. Like, these are all the things that give us pleasure as humans. Does it have safe surf? Does it have moderate winds? Does it have warm water? So these are all the things I ranked in a way. Well, I ranked the beaches, but these are the categories that I looked at. Beyond of my four headings, fundamental assets was one, infrastructural connective webs. So does a site like a beach have a parallel main road? Does it have a perpendicular main road? Does it have public transport? Does it have dense urban fabric adjacent to it? An established economic base? Is it used by the local in its web, or more tourist, or more regional? Does it have adjacent urban runoff? So even that I'm seeing as part of the connective web. Does it have an adjacent marina? Certainly White Bay does. That's part of its web of connectivity. Elaborations, I'm sorry, I've cut off the top of that. Elaborations was my third kind of category. How has it been elaborated? Does it have access to the sea? Does it have a promenade? How wide is it? Is it continuous? Is there shade? Is there shade on the promenade? Is there a lawn? Is there a kiosk? Is there a cafe, restaurant, adjacent hotels? Walkable pier? Is there a constructed pool? A fun fair? Is there lighting? Showers, toilets, bins? So this is all the elaborations that happen on beaches that I could make an inventory of. Are there cars on the beach? Is there a conscious horizon line link? Some beaches around the world seem to have that. Some don't. I became quite interested in that. And then my fourth one was always a bit of a summation. And in some ways, it's probably the most interesting of them. This idea of thickening. So does a site, does it become so powerful? And you could say Capitol Hill, which ends up having such a thickening. It imbued all of Rome with its spatial layout, which ended up imbuing so many cities all around the world. So here on these beaches, is there adjacent public institutions? Are there artificial additions of public space? Like, oh, we've just put a huge slab of lawn there because people want to be there. So St Kilda Beach has that. Bondi Beach certainly has it. Adjacent public institutions might be things like art galleries or hospitals, government buildings. Is there a horizon line link with the city? Are there cultural city beach links? Are there adjacent hotel precincts? So these, for me at the time, and I think there's more and less, and these are just concepts. This isn't fact, I'm telling you. This is just a way of me trying to understand the world around me, like for all of us. Thickening is the growth of the construction around a biased event. And in the case of the urban beach, thickening is the urbanisation of the beaches program. So again, this is from my master's. So and I was down in Melbourne at the time, but I could do it with Bondi too. Using the local St Kilda to clarify further thickening, how adjacent public institutions down in Melbourne has like Luna Park, has the cafe strip, the swimming baths, Catani Gardens, artificial addition of public space, and St Kilda Marina, Alfred Square. You can look back over these details. Overall, though, what I have begun to realise, and what I began to realise then, but it comes in my mind, is what I've highlighted there. Development consumes the scenographic view to the horizon. So I think coming out of Europe and coming out of that influence of Rome and the scenographic, how urban development becomes that. So you can see that in the fancy old harbour town of Sydney. Anything with a view is worth more. So White Bay is going to be worth more. It's worth a bomb because of that fabulous view up the harbour. So development consumes the scenographic view to the horizon. I think that's probably holds a lot of truth for many cities with water in them particularly, or even not, mountains, the Alps, etc. And they often are based on this very Baroque setup of space. That's a painting called View of a City with Harbour. It's in the Boat Museum. But there's foreground, middle ground, and horizon in the distance. So I would say personally, I have a bias around that. Where I found that I couldn't find that to be true, I spent some time in Dubai, and I found that didn't have that same bias. It's very flat, but I found many of the streets, things are linking to their water body, only a few of them provided a baroque sequence of expectation and resolution to the scenographic. Hardly any of them did. It just sort of didn't happen. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but and I've seen the same thing happen within Indigenous communities when I've spent time there, certainly up in Fitzroy Crossing in the Kimberley. I mean, these are sort of some deeper concepts, but this idea of the accepted visual hierarchies or an accepted accent. So we tend to, and we all do it. You know, this isn't a criticism. I'm trying to acknowledge my own biases, my own visual hierarchies. And there's, you know, in context and out of context. We can oversimplify, we can normalize, we can deny the unique. So that exact quality that Beth Meyer is picking up on, the site speaks prior to the act of design, that those exact qualities we're starting to see in White Bay from so many site visits suddenly. Some people are able to step into working with them, and some people kind of deny the unique, the one-off, the locally specific. And often as landscape architects, we can normalise and oversimplify. We transform and incorporate problems into safe, well-established disciplinary routines in the interests of the universal or global legibility, at the expense of local or regional value. And I would say now in 2021, what we desperately need is the local and regional value. And I would say Indigenous perspective has always put a lot of emphasis on that, and that is a big philosophical shift in the practice of it. There can be a complete lack of community input, denial of the value of abiding events. I'm sorry, I've cut that off, and I might speak more about it another day, but just keep it in your mind, this idea of abiding events of the place. They live in the place, floods, heat, and the effects that these can have on local customs and practices. And we see that in Indigenous thinking. Oh, look, whose drawing was this that I've stolen? Lewis, thank you for this. It was beautifully put up. Glebe Point Island was not always a flat concrete expanse. We know that. Thank you, Lewis, for that image that I've stolen. Thank you again, Lewis. What is left of the original shoreline? How can we restore and restitch the identity of Glebe Point Island as a headland park within the Sydney harbour? That's a really good question. It's a really good question. And it's good to be holding this entanglement of time and an entanglement of scale. And when we think of Rome and we think of Capel Hill, you can see how one thing kind of led to another, which then led to another, which led to another. And so, you know, what we do, what we impose can have very long-term impact. Thank you, Chuk, for also, I'm stealing your images here, about site qualities and edge studies transforming over time. So we're starting to see that. Now, how could that continue? So maybe when the early European settlers cleared the land, when they arrived in Sydney Harbour, got out of their boats, started building settlements, started clearing land, maybe they started clearing the land so they could be looking at the harbour, looking at for safety, you know, who's coming up the harbour. But in doing that, perhaps they removed and reduced their abilities to be in. Now, I was in the city yesterday, actually, and, you know, in the CBD, there are 2 eucalyptus trees right near the Opera House, between the Opera House and Government House. They're the only 2 trees that were within the CBD area before the settlements came. You know, nothing, everything was cleared. So it's why was it cleared? And I just try to sort of think it through. And I guess part of these concepts I'm talking about is this attachment to the looking at the safety of it, etc. Interestingly though, Capel Hill was originally, it seems from records coming out, a burial ground. So, you know, in a way that's probably more linked to Indigenous thinking of high ground having a different sense of importance and ceremony. Design thinking is a comparable analogy of Indigenous thinking. Let's try this out for fun. And I did this a little bit in January, and I don't hold this very lightly, but I do like Tyson's book, Sand Talk. He talks about carving a piece of, he makes different pieces for each chapter as he's writing it. The idea of doing something, of making, the idea of making as helping thinking, I think is a good one. Now I'm getting quite simplistic, but in my mind I keep trying, could I begin to equate this idea of fundamental assets with the Indigenous idea of country, or how we talk about that, events of the place. And I think some of that crosses over. I don't think all of it does, this idea of fundamental assets, but the orientation of the sun to it. Is it cold? Is it hot? How often does the tide move? When does it move? When does the wattle flower? What are the fundamental assets of a site? Could elaborations be things like tree scars, skin markings? Could I begin to think of infrastructural connective webs as song lines? Lines of walking, communications and transport. Now, the ridge roads of Sydney, seen in this image at the right, were always the main walking routes for Indigenous people and the early settlers. And now they're the main roads. So that's the Balmain Peninsula. Our sites over here on the right. Now they're the main roads, so Military Road and Mossman Bondi Road and Darling Street here in Balmain. Up on that crest of the high ground here. The other infrastructure, the other connected webs, ferry routes, shipping ports, marinas, our site's got lots of them. Metro stations. And this idea of thickening. So our site, does our site have a thickening capacity? It certainly does. So that sort of wider inhabitation. Perhaps we could think of that as different Aboriginal cultures or totems, where there's a sort of, the site and the country has a sort of wider influence into the human cultures around it. And here, now in current urbanisation, Sydney Harbour, the deepest and largest harbour in the world, makes a city. That's not a bad thing about thickening. I just want to sort of, in a way, there's sort of the bigger theoretical concepts I wanted to talk into a little bit more. Bacon's idea of principle of the second person, Beth Meyer's site speaks prior to the act of design, and this idea of, from my masters, of fundamental assets and thickening and webs, as well as this idea of time. I just want to draw us to some nice images, because we've had so much sort of textier stuff in this presentation, but water is a spatial experience. So I find Mary Mrs. Greenwood Pond double site project just fantastic. And I look at it today and getting this lecture together, and I think part of that is because it starts to be a cyborg of being in and looking at. You can be in the water as well as just look at it as a sort of exterior pattern. Again, this lovely image that I've always liked up the top. But again, I'm looking at this idea of cyborg, where things might be being in and looking at. This project is great, I think, on many levels. Not all levels, I could talk more about it, but it's by my very good friend Kath Stutterheim and Charles Anderson, as well as members of Aspect, Kirsten Bauer. And I realise, I'm sorry, I haven't listed them up there, but Aspect were involved in that. It's the Emergency Services Memorial down in Canberra on Burley Griffin. And I know from many conversations with Kath, the idea of the top line of the sculpture was that it was going to reflect that horizon line of the hills surrounding Canberra. And that poetic and that realisation, I think, is so very strong. And it's a good one for landscape architects to be having a go at. How you that foreground and the distance within that same thinking, and this idea of scales. Here on the left, this is Versailles, where I was bloody lucky enough to spend 6 months as part of my landscape architecture degree at the school there, which is terrific and has a lot of good thinkers. It's a small school, but a lot of good thinkers. I see a few of them popping out in that conference in Barcelona coming up in the next week, which I hope you've all got yourself tickets to, at least some of it. The space I want to draw you to is the black and white tiled space in the middle of that photograph on the left. This sort of small as an interior relating to the extra large by axes. So those photographs, if you can work that out, if you stand on the black and white tiled interior space, you see the image on the right through out to the little suburban kind of city of Versailles. And of course, that's the front door of the palace, and the back door looks out to the amazing landscape by Le Notre and that strong axis. When you're in the space, it feels like a room. It's incredible. The detail, it's an interior. And that's why I want to just sort of pull this in here. And I put it in there with this kind of idea in my mind, this idea of coming out of that metro station, that strong pull visually of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. You know, what that could be, how you could play with that potential of a sort of interior space looking out to that grand axis. Again, this kind of combination of being in a space and playing with the looking at. And I think this is just such a wonderful project and a sort of contemporary landscape architect project by the Swiss firm Voigt, the Novartis campus. And they did several parts of the Novartis company's landscape, but it's this particular one that I'm really interested in. And looking at the fundamental assets of the surrounding landscape and the kind of eroded rock forms they had around them, they mimicked that with an idea. That whole image on the bottom of that is constructed, I think it's cement, and you can look it up online, but you can see their project development drawings and the construction drawings. They've chipped back into that cement to create all these fissures so that ecologies can grow on it. And there's a lovely interplay with the extra small, the sort of microscopic idea of an ecology forming and mosses, etc. And, you know, sort of medium scale, the building of this wall with a bit of an idea of framing. That's why, you know, perhaps playing with looking at. Many of these things sit in the grey space for analysis, but I'm just suggesting how these could begin to be used. The idea of, you know, people talking about seasons, and I think it's crucial, mandatory really, to start talking about seasons in Australia on any site in a much more sophisticated way than the 4 seasons, which we inherited from the Northern Hemisphere and through most of European writings, I suppose. But this is an Adelaide University landscape architecture student work, and I apologise, I don't have their name here, nor have I asked for their permission. I clicked it when they were presenting. But some of you will have seen these, where you can get a kind of circular seasonal calendar, which is showing all sorts of minute movements of animals and flowerings. You know, fan-tailed cuckoo generally have insects for their food, and yellow thornbill gets attracted to the nectar. Thus, species were introduced which attract the insects and flowers year-round. So some real clear reasons why a decision's getting made about what plantings. And they're not based on just what they look like. They're based on their ability to impact the process of the site, of being in the site. And to be able to do that, one needs to start having a real analysis into how the site's working. And it's sort of coming up and down. Those seeping walls, I think, of the sandstone become quite significant. So when people are talking about water-sensitive urban design, they now need to really start to be very site-specific to White Bays. This is not a generic housing development that could be anywhere in the world. We're not just talking about surface water or rooftop water. We are talking about toxic submersed water. We're also talking about sandstone on one side, the Balmain side, which is seeping continually, fantastically. What can you do with that? You know, how does it work? Oh, look at me. Look, here's an honest truth. I'm now a weaver's son-in-law. I'm a really crap weaver, actually. Sorry, I mean that rub. I'm not good. I don't have the patience for it. But my partner Dawn is very good at it, and her mother is New Zealand's whatever on again, off again, president of the Creative Fibres Association. So there's a lot of weaving, but I couldn't help but think of Tyson's ability to be wood carving into wood and making boomerangs whilst he wrote every chapter of his book. And in putting some of this lecture together, I've certainly been embedded a little bit in that project, disentangling the wool. In all honesty, my wonderful partner Dawn has done the bulk of it, but I've done a bit of it. But it is certainly the idea of, drawing, the idea of making as one thinks. I think, stepping into this idea, I think becomes useful. And just to begin to finish off, I just want to reference back this being in country to that wonderful map that Caroline Pidcock showed, this being in country and, the complexity of that, of all the languages that were with us on this country. Many have now sadly not with us, but of all the complexity and the specificity that they represent. Different names for different animals in different regions, different flowerings, so much specificity. And we reduce things. We say, oh, it's autumn. So I'm going to put leaves, trees that drop leaves. Now it's spring. So I'm going to put a flowering tree. Like those reductions just are not of this country. They're not of this place. So I think we need to just continually be on our toes about that. Shufeng, thank you for this image. I just wanted to put up a couple of your own images that I saw on Thursday, where I can see people wonderfully grappling with these ideas of site specificity and being in. That this is a good analysis of how does water use, like what are the issues? A lot of the issues are subterranean issues. They're about porous sandstone and direction of water flow, and about tides going in and out to that, and this exchange of toxic materials. Thank you, Shufeng. And to finish off with Sam's poetic and terrific suggestion, I guess, here of an imposition. Suggestions of being in, suggestions of being site-specific, the landscape cyborg, time past and ahead, and also fundamental assets by our Sam Lockwood. I thought what this could be as a generative idea. Sam's idea here is what if the pylons underneath the apron, near where the old isthmus would be, what if they had roots? How could we reconsider that? Mend roots of industry, bedrock on the bottom. The drawing unto itself, the language used is it floats in between. It's history, it's current, it's industry, it's less modified nature. Bedrock, that bedrock could be 1 million years old. Those pylons have a decaying history. So I think that's a rich image. I think it's a really rich image. I'm pretty sure that's the end, folks. That's really all I've got. I will come back, stop presenting, just really to say goodbye to you, really. Hopefully that. Anyway, that's it for that's it. Hi again. That's it for today. I will endeavour to get Project 2 to you in the next couple of days, and certainly we will talk that through on Tuesday. So enjoy the rest of the weekend. I hope I haven't overwhelmed you a bit with some of that sort of theory kind of thinking, and I'm just always trying to pull into it and how we use it to make meaningful drawings and to make good decisions in the public space. We owe it to the broader population. Signing off from here. See you on Tuesday.